My name is Sarah Miller and I'm 29 years old. I am a pediatric nurse, a profession that teaches you how to keep your composure while a child is screaming and their parents are falling apart in front of you. I'm used to high-stress environments, used to people looking at me for answers, but nothing in my medical training prepared me for the day my own father looked me in the eye and told me I was dead to him. I was standing in the foyer of the mansion I grew up in, a place of marble floors and echoing silence, holding the hand of the man I loved. David Vance was standing beside me, wearing his best suit, which, to be honest, was a bit tight in the shoulders because of the muscle he'd built working under cars all day. He looked like a man trying his best to honor a tradition he didn't belong to. My father, Richard Miller, didn't even look at David's face. He looked at the grease under his fingernails that wouldn't quite scrub away, and then he looked at me with a disgust so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "If you walk out that door with this grease monkey," my father said, his voice as cold as a surgical blade, "don't bother looking back. You won't have a cent, you won't have a name, and you certainly won't have a family." I didn't hesitate. I squeezed David's hand, felt the calluses and the strength there, and I walked out. Before I tell you how that single step led to a revelation that would leave my father speechless and my sister trembling in a boardroom 2 years later, tell me, what time is it for you right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like where you are? I'm curious to see how far this story of pride and hidden empires will travel. The silence that followed my departure was deafening. For months, my mother, Eleanor, and my sister, Chloe, acted as if I had simply ceased to exist. No phone calls, no texts, no birthday wishes. I went from being the golden daughter of the Miller estate to a woman living in a 2-bedroom apartment near the hospital, surviving on a nurse's salary and David's modest income from the garage. To my family, David was just the mechanic. They saw the blue overalls, the smudge of oil on his cheek, and the aging truck he drove, and they drew a conclusion. In their world, your value was measured by the logo on your key fob and the zip code of your office. They didn't see the man who stayed up until 2 a.m. studying engineering manuals. They didn't see the man who treated every customer at the shop with a level of respect my father wouldn't show his own board of directors. To them, I had traded a life of pearls and galas for a life of rest and struggle. But let me take you back to the beginning, to the night the cracks in my family's polished veneer first started to show. I met David on a rainy Tuesday when my expensive European sedan, a graduation gift from my father, broke down on the side of the highway. I was terrified, watching the steam rise from the hood, feeling helpless. David was the one who pulled over. He didn't ask for money, he didn't even ask for my name at first. He just rolled up his sleeves, fixed a blown hose in the pouring rain, and refused to let me drive off until he was sure the engine was stable. He was kind, grounded, and completely unimpressed by the luxury car I was sitting in. When I offered him $100 for his help, he laughed and said, "Just get home safe, Sarah. And maybe buy a car that's built for driving, not just for looking at." That was the spark. Over the next 6 months, I found excuses to visit the garage where he worked. It was a gritty, loud place called Vance & Sons, tucked away in an industrial part of town that my sister Chloe wouldn't be caught dead in. I fell in love with the way David talked about machines, as if they had souls that just needed a little care. When I finally brought him home to meet my parents, I thought, perhaps naively, that they would see what I saw. I thought they would value his character over his bank account. The dinner was a disaster from the first course. My father, Richard, spent 20 minutes talking about the latest merger he was spearheading, while my mother, Eleanor, kept adjusting her pearls every time David spoke. Chloe, always the most vicious, didn't even hide her smirk. "So, David," she started, swirling her wine, "Sarah says you work with cars. I've been thinking of getting the new Ferrari. Do you think your little shop could handle an oil change on something that costs more than your house?" David didn't flinch. He just smiled politely and said, "The engine doesn't care about the price tag, Chloe. It just cares about the friction. I'm sure we could manage." My father didn't find it charming. "A mechanic," Richard muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I spent $80,000 on your nursing degree so you could marry a man who smells like a gas station?" "He's an honest man, Dad," I replied, my face burning. He works harder than anyone I know. Hard work is for people who don't have brains, Sarah, Richard snapped. In this family, we don't work for the machine. We own the company that makes it. That night ended with the ultimatum. My father told me that if I continued to see David, I would be stripped of my inheritance, my trust fund, and my position in the family social circle. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg. Instead, I packed a bag. I moved in with David 3 days later. Our wedding was a small affair at City Hall. There were no Millers in the pews. No white roses, no 5-tier cake, no photographers from the local society magazine. It was just me, David, and 2 of his friends from the shop. I wore a simple white dress I bought on sale, and David wore a suit he'd saved up for months to buy. When the judge pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a sense of freedom I had never known, but I also felt the sting of a door being slammed shut behind me. For the first 2 years of our marriage, things were tight. Being a pediatric nurse is rewarding, but it doesn't pay the bills of a woman who was raised in a mansion. We lived in a neighborhood where the sirens were constant, and our vacations were weekend camping trips in David's old truck. My sister Chloe would occasionally send me pity emails, usually containing photos of her at various resorts or a picture of a new designer bag, always with a caption like, "thinking of you. Hope the apartment isn't too cramped." I never replied. I was happy. David was my rock. Every evening when I came home from a 12-hour shift, exhausted from seeing sick children, he was there with dinner ready and a smile that made the rest of the world disappear. However, David was secretive about one thing. He worked incredibly long hours. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until 4 a.m., and when I asked him why the shop was so busy, he'd just say, "Just some high-end restoration work, Sarah. It takes time to get the details right." He never complained about being tired. He never complained about money. In fact, despite our modest lifestyle, we never seemed to actually run out of it. When my car needed expensive tires, he bought the best ones. When I mentioned I wanted to take a specialized nursing course that cost $3,000, the money appeared in our joint account the next day. "I did some overtime," he'd say with a shrug. I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was a mechanic. He worked with his hands. I didn't realize that while I was busy tending to patients, David was building something far larger than a repair shop. I didn't realize that my family's arrogance had blinded them to a very simple truth: not everyone who wears a name tag is an employee. The turning point came on a Tuesday, exactly 2 years after my father disowned me. I was at the hospital when I received an urgent message in the family group chat, a chat I was still technically in, though I never spoke. My father was hosting a partners gala at the Miller corporate headquarters. It was the biggest event of the year, meant to celebrate a massive expansion of the family's investment firm. But there was a problem. The keynote speaker and the primary investor for the expansion, a man representing a massive automotive conglomerate, had requested a private meeting before the gala. Chloe had sent a frantic message, "Dad is losing his mind. The investor is some young billionaire who bought out 3 major dealerships last month, and he's being incredibly difficult about the terms. If this deal doesn't go through, the firm is in trouble." I ignored it, as usual. I had a double shift and a 5-year-old with a fever to worry about. But then, David called me. His voice sounded different, sharper, more confident. "Sarah," he said, "I need you to do me a favor. There's a tuxedo and a garment bag in the back of your closet. I need you to put on that navy blue silk dress you love, the one you wore to your graduation, and meet me at the Miller Plaza at 7 p.m. I was confused. The Miller Plaza? David, that's my father's building. We aren't allowed within a mile of that place. What's going on? Did you get a job doing security there? I heard a soft chuckle on the other end of the line. Something like that. Just trust me, Sarah. For once, I want you to walk into that building and not feel like the daughter who was kicked out. I want you to walk in as my wife. I hesitated. The thought of seeing my father's sneer or Chloe's mocking eyes made my stomach turn, but there was something in David's voice, a quiet authority I had never heard before. I went home, found the tuxedo I didn't know he owned, and put on the navy dress. I did my hair and makeup with trembling hands. As I drove to the plaza, I kept thinking about the grease under David's fingernails and the way my father had called him a nobody. When I arrived at the grand entrance of the Miller corporate headquarters, the valet didn't even look at my old car. He tried to wave me away until I showed him the invitation David had left on the passenger seat. It was a gold-embossed card that didn't have David's name on it, it just said the Vance Group. I walked into the lobby, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was filled with the elite of the city. Diamonds, champagne, and the smell of old money. I saw my mother first, standing near a fountain, looking regal and distant. Then I saw Chloe, surrounded by a group of admirers, laughing at something on her phone. And finally, I saw my father, Richard, standing at the center of the room, looking uncharacteristically nervous, checking his watch every 30 seconds. He was waiting for the man who held the future of his company in his hands. He was waiting for the owner of the dealership empire that had recently swallowed up half the market. He was waiting for the man he had called a grease monkey 2 years ago. I stood in the shadows near a marble pillar, watching my father's face. He looked desperate. He looked like a man who was about to realize that the world was much bigger than his boardroom. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall opened. The room went silent. A man stepped out, flanked by 4 assistants in sharp suits. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like armor. His hair was slicked back, and his posture was commanding. For a second, I didn't recognize him. But then he looked toward the pillar where I was standing, and he smiled. It was David. But it wasn't the David who fixed blown hoses in the rain. This was David Vance, the CEO of Vance Automotive, the man who owned the very dealership my father had been trying to partner with for months. My father stepped forward, his hand extended, a fake, practiced smile on his face. "Mr. Vance!" Richard exclaimed, his voice booming with forced warmth. "We are so honored you could make it. I believe we have much to discuss regarding the merger." David didn't take his hand. He didn't even acknowledge the gesture. He just stood there, looking at my father with a cold, steady gaze that made the air in the room feel thin. "We do have things to discuss, Richard," David said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "But first, I believe you owe someone an apology." Richard blinked, his smile faltering. "An apology? I'm afraid I don't follow, Mr. Vance. Who would I possibly need to apologize to in my own building?" David turned slightly and reached out his hand toward the shadows. "My wife," he said clearly. The room gasped. I felt every eye in the hall turn toward me as I stepped out from behind the pillar. I saw my mother's glass of champagne slip from her hand, shattering on the marble floor. I saw Chloe's jaw drop so low it was almost comical. But most of all, I saw my father. The color drained from his face until he was the shade of a ghost. His eyes darted from me to David, and then back to me, the realization hitting him like a physical collapse. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. I didn't say a word. I walked over to David, took his hand, the same hand that still had a faint, permanent trace of engine oil near the cuticles, and stood tall. The grease monkey wasn't just a mechanic. He was the man who was about to decide whether my father's legacy lived or died. And as David looked at the man who had disowned me, I realized that the real story wasn't just about the money. It was about what happens when you treat the wrong person like they're invisible. But the night was just getting started, and the deal my father was so desperate for? It came with a price he never expected to pay, a price that would involve every asset the Miller family owned. David leaned in closer to my father, his voice a low, dangerous growl that only those of us standing nearby could hear. "You told her she wasn't a Miller anymore," David said. "Well, tonight, Richard, you're going to find out what it feels like to be a nobody in your own empire." My father's eyes widened, his breath hitching in his chest. He looked around the room, realizing that his peers, his competitors, and his board members were all watching his humiliation. He tried to speak, tried to find a way to pivot, but for the first time in his life, Richard Miller had no leverage. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only person who could pull him back was the daughter he had erased. I looked at my sister, Chloe, who was now clutching her designer bag as if it could protect her. She looked terrified. She knew that if David pulled the funding, her lifestyle, the cars, the trips, the vanity, would vanish overnight. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I remembered the pity emails. I remembered the way she laughed when I was cut off. I felt a coldness in my heart that mirrored David's. "David," my father finally stammered, "surely we can be professional. This is a business matter. My daughter and we had a misunderstanding, but family is family." David's grip on my hand tightened, not in anger, but in a protective, solid way. "Family is family," David repeated, his voice dripping with irony. "That's a funny thing to say now, Richard. Because for the last 2 years, my wife hasn't had a father. She's had a bully. And tonight, the bully is out of luck." As David began to lead me toward the private conference room, leaving my family standing in the middle of the gala-like statues, I knew the next hour would change everything. The mechanic was about to open the hood of the Miller Corporation, and he wasn't there to fix the engine, he was there to dismantle it. But before the first contract was even pulled out, a voice came from the back of the crowd, a voice that made even David freeze. It was a man I hadn't seen in years, an old rival of my father's who had been watching from the sidelines. And what he said next would turn David's triumph into a fight for our very lives. The man who had stepped out of the shadows was Marcus Thorne, the one person my father feared more than a total market collapse. Marcus was a corporate shark who had spent 3 decades trying to swallow Miller Enterprises whole, and as he stood there, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, a predatory smile stretched across his face. "Careful, David," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "If you signed that merger tonight, you're not just buying a company. You're buying a crime scene." The room went so silent you could hear the ice melting in the glasses of the terrified socialites. My mother, Eleanor, let out a soft, choked gasp, her hand flying to the diamond necklace that had likely been bought with money the company no longer actually had. Richard, my father, looked like he was about to have a stroke. His face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. "Marcus, this is a private family matter," Richard hissed, though his voice lacked its usual venom. It sounded like a plea. "Family?" Marcus laughed, stepping closer to our small circle. "Is that what you call it, Richard? Disowning your eldest daughter for marrying a man you thought was beneath you, only to realize that mechanic is the CEO of the Vance Automotive Group? The very group that holds 40% of your debt." Marcus turned his gaze to David. "He didn't tell you, did he, David? He didn't tell you about the offshore accounts or the creative accounting used to hide the fact that Miller Enterprises is currently 6 months away from total insolvency?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I looked at David, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knew David was successful. I knew he had built a massive business from the ground up while I was working double shifts at the pediatric ward, but I didn't know the full extent of my father's desperation. I didn't know Richard had been trying to bait my husband into a trap to save his own skin. David didn't look surprised. In fact, his expression was so calm it was chilling. He didn't let go of my hand. If anything, his thumb brushed over my knuckles in a reassuring rhythm. "I knew, Marcus," David said quietly. Richard's jaw dropped. You knew?" "I'm a mechanic, Richard," David said, the word dripping with a lethal irony. "I know how to look under the hood. I know how to spot a leak before the engine blows. I've had my legal team dismantling your board of directors for the last 6 months. I didn't come here tonight to sign a merger. I came here to sign a foreclosure." Chloe, my sister, stepped forward, her eyes wide and rimmed with tears. "Sarah, you can't let him do this. This is our legacy. If the company goes under, we lose everything. The house, the cars. Sarah, please. We're sisters." I looked at Chloe. I looked at the girl who had sent me photos of the family's European vacation while I was struggling to pay for groceries. I looked at the sister who had told me I was dead to the family because I chose love over a trust fund. You told me I wasn't a Miller anymore, Chloe, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You told me that if I wanted to live like a commoner, I should get used to the consequences. Well, these are the consequences. You lived on a pedestal built with other people's money, and you never cared who was crushed underneath it. Sarah, my mother wailed, stepping toward me. How can you be so cold? I raised you in luxury. I gave you everything. You gave me everything except a choice, Mom, I replied. And when I finally made one, you threw me out like yesterday's trash. You didn't even call when I was hospitalized with exhaustion last year. David was the one who stayed by my bed. David was the one who worked 20-hour days in his shop so I could finish my nursing degree without debt. You didn't give me anything. You lent it to me, and you expected my soul as interest. The crowd was leaning in now, the scandal of the century unfolding in real time. But David wasn't interested in the spectacle. He looked at Richard. We're going to the conference room, David commanded. It wasn't a request. Marcus, you're coming too. Since you're so interested in the crime scene, you can help me decide which parts are worth salvaging and which parts I'm going to let the feds handle. As we walked away from the glittering lights of the ballroom and into the cold, sterile hallway leading to the executive offices, the atmosphere changed. The smell of expensive perfume was replaced by the scent of old paper and desperation. My father walked ahead of us, his shoulders hunched, looking every bit the defeated man he was. Once inside the soundproof room, David sat at the head of the mahogany table. He didn't look like the man who spent his Saturdays under the chassis of a truck. He looked like a king. Sit down, Richard, David said. My father sat. Eleanor and Chloe hovered by the door, looking like ghosts. David pulled a thick blue folder from his briefcase. He slid it across the table. This is a list of every ethical violation, every tax loophole, and every fraudulent signature you've authorized in the last 5 years. It's all here. My investigators were very thorough. Richard's hand shook as he opened the folder. He didn't even get past the 3rd page before he closed it and looked up, his eyes glassy. What do you want, David? Money? You already have more than I do. Revenge? You've already humiliated us. I don't want your money, Richard, David said, leaning forward. And revenge is for people who have nothing better to do with their time. I want the truth. I want Sarah to hear exactly why you did it. I looked at my father, confused. Why you did what? David looked at me, his eyes softening for the first time that night. Sarah, your father didn't just disown you because I was a mechanic. He disowned you because he had already spent your inheritance. He used your trust fund to cover the first wave of losses 3 years ago. He needed you out of the family so you wouldn't ask questions when you turned 30 and the money wasn't there. The room went cold. I felt a buzzing in my ears. I looked at Richard, waiting for him to deny it. I waited for him to scream that David was lying, that he loved me, that he would never steal from his own child. But Richard couldn't look me in the eye. He stared at the blue folder like it was his own gravestone. Is it true? I whispered. Sarah, the market was failing. Richard started, his voice cracking. I thought I could replace it. I just needed a little more time. You stole from me, I said, the realization hitting me harder than the disowning ever had. You didn't just kick me out. You robbed me to save your own ego. And then you had the nerve to call me ungrateful? Eleanor stepped forward, her face a mask of desperation. We did it for the family, Sarah. To keep the name alive. You have a husband who is wealthy now, you don't need that money. But we have nothing else. You have nothing because you built your life on a lie, I snapped. David slammed his hand on the table, the sound like a gunshot. Enough. Here is the deal. I am buying Miller Enterprises for $1. I will assume the debts, and I will personally oversee the restructuring. Richard, you will resign immediately. You will sign over the deed to the family estate to Sarah. It's her inheritance, what's left of it. You and Eleanor will move into the condo in Florida, the one you thought I didn't know about. Richard gasped. The condo, but that's tiny. It's for retirees. Then you'll fit right in, David said coldly. As for Chloe, she's going to get a job. I've already contacted a few of my associates. There's an entry-level position in a call center waiting for her. If she works hard, she might be able to afford a studio apartment by next year. Chloe let out a shriek of horror. A call center? David, you can't be serious. I'm a Miller. Tonight, David said, standing up, the name Miller means bankrupt. Tomorrow, it means employee. Take it, or I hand this folder to Marcus Thorne and let him call the district attorney. The choice is yours. Richard looked at the folder, then at me, then at the man he had once called a grease monkey. He realized that the mechanic didn't just know how to fix things, he knew how to break them, too. But as Richard reached for the pen to sign away his empire, the door to the conference room burst open. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a guard. It was a woman I recognized from the hospital, a woman who looked terrified. Sarah. David, she panted. You have to leave. Now. There are people downstairs, men in suits. They're not here for the gala. They're asking about the Vance acquisition, and they don't look like lawyers. David stood up abruptly, his protective instincts kicking in instantly. He reached for my hand, pulling me behind him. I saw Marcus Thorne's face go pale, not with fear for us, but with the realization of who was coming. Richard, Marcus whispered, who else did you take money from? My father didn't answer. He just stared at the door, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The mechanic had opened the hood, but what we found inside wasn't just a broken engine. It was a ticking bomb, and we were all trapped in the room with it. David, I whispered, my heart racing, what's happening? Stay behind me, Sarah, David said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous growl. Richard didn't just steal from you. He took a loan from people who don't use courtrooms to get their money back. The lights in the conference room flickered once, then twice, before plunging us into total darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard the heavy thud of boots in the hallway. My family had disowned me for marrying a mechanic, but as the door began to creak open, I realized that my husband was the only thing standing between us and a debt that was about to be paid in blood. But as the first shadow stepped into the room, a voice rang out, a voice that didn't belong to a debt collector. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, one that made my mother scream in a way I would never forget. The secret Richard had been keeping was far darker than a stolen trust fund, and the person coming for us was someone we all thought was dead. The woman who stepped into the room was trembling, but it wasn't the woman from the hospital anymore. Standing in the doorway, framed by the cold light of the hallway, was a figure that turned the air in the room to ice. My mother, Eleanor, didn't just gasp, she made a sound like the air was being punched out of her lungs. She collapsed back into her velvet chair, her hands clutching her throat. Arthur, she whispered, her voice cracking. It can't be. You died in the Alps. The accident, the search teams. The search teams that Richard paid to stop looking after 48 hours, the man said. His voice was a low rasp, like gravel grinding against metal. He looked older than my father, his face lined with the kind of hard living the Millers usually paid to avoid, but his eyes, those sharp, piercing blue eyes, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. This was Arthur Miller, my father's older brother. The man who was supposed to be the rightful heir to the Miller empire before a tragic skiing accident 20 years ago paved the way for Richard to take the throne. Richard's face didn't just go pale, it turned a sickly shade of gray. The folder in his hand hit the mahogany table with a heavy thud. You're a ghost, Richard stammered, backing away toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I saw the wreckage. I saw the reports. You saw what you bought, Richard, Arthur said, stepping fully into the room. Behind him, the men in suits Sarah's friend had warned us about filed in. They weren't debt collectors. They were carrying badges and black briefcases embossed with the seal of the SEC and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. David didn't look surprised. He didn't even flinch. He simply stepped to the side, keeping his body between me and the chaos, his hand still firmly anchored to mine. In that moment, I looked at my husband, the man my family had spent years calling a grease monkey and a gutter dweller, and I realized that the mechanic hadn't just been fixing cars. He had been rebuilding a shattered history. "Sarah," David whispered, leaning close to my ear. "I'm sorry I had to keep this from you. I couldn't risk Richard finding out until Arthur was safe and the evidence was locked down. I found him 3 years ago in a small town in Oregon, living under a fake name, hiding because he thought your father still had the reach to finish the job he started in the mountains." I felt the room spinning. As a pediatric nurse, I was used to crises. I was used to the high-stakes pressure of a code blue, the frantic heartbeat of a child in distress. But this was a different kind of trauma. My entire childhood, the foundation of my family's wealth, the very reason I had been pressured to marry up and disowned for marrying down, it was all built on a murder attempt. "You did this?" I breathed, looking at David. "All this time?" "He came to my shop," Arthur said, looking at me with a sad, weary smile. I was driving a beat-up truck that had no business being on the road. "David didn't just fix the engine, Sarah." He looked at me, saw the Miller ring I still wore around my neck, and he asked the right questions. "He's been taking care of me ever since. He's the reason I'm standing here." Chloe let out a hysterical laugh, her socialite mask finally shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "So what? So he's alive. That doesn't change anything. Richard is the CEO. The documents are signed." "The documents are fraudulent," Chloe, one of the men in suits said, stepping forward. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of files. "We've been monitoring the Vance acquisition for months. Mr. Vance here provided us with 20 years of backdated ledgers that Richard thought he had burned. It turns out, when you hire a mechanic to dispose of industrial waste, you should make sure he doesn't know how to read a balance sheet." David looked at Richard, his expression one of pure, calculated coldness. "I started working for your subsidiary 10 years ago, Richard. Not because I needed the job, my family had their own money, but because I wanted to see exactly how you operated. I saw the grease, all right. But it wasn't on my hands. It was on your soul. Every time you insulted me, every time you told Sarah I wasn't good enough to breathe the same air as you, I just added another page to the file." Richard let out a roar of frustration, a cornered animal realizing the cage was finally locked. "I built this. I kept the name alive." Arthur was weak. He would have let the company slide into obscurity. "You didn't build it," Arthur barked, his voice regaining the authority of the man who had once been the golden boy of the industry. "You stole it. And then you tried to steal Sarah's future, too. You treated your own daughter like a liability because she had the heart you lacked." My mother, Eleanor, was trembling so hard the ice in her neglected glass rattled. "Richard, tell them it's not true. Tell them David is lying. He's just a mechanic, Richard. He's trying to ruin us." "He's not just a mechanic, Eleanor," David said, his voice ringing out with a power that silenced the room. "And I'm not just the owner of the dealership you tried to buy. My name is David Vance, and my family owns Vance Global Logistics. We've been the primary competitor to Miller International for 3 decades. I didn't marry Sarah for her name. I married her because she was the only thing in this godforsaken family that wasn't for sale." The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe looked like she was about to faint. The mechanic she had mocked, the man she had tried to get me to divorce so I could marry one of her suitable friends, was heir to a fortune that made the Millers look like middle management. You're a Vance?" Chloe stammered, her eyes wide with a horrific mix of greed and regret. "From the Chicago Vances? The ones who don't need to steal from their children to pay their debts," David replied. One of the agents stepped toward my father. "Richard Miller, you are under arrest for securities fraud, embezzlement, and the attempted conspiracy to commit murder. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoed through the room like a gavel. I watched as the man who had loomed over my life like an unbreakable titan was reduced to a shriveled, terrified old man. He looked at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he had never shown. "Sarah," he rasped as they began to lead him away. "Sarah, talk to them. Tell them I did it for the family. For you." I looked at him, and for the first time in 29 years, I didn't feel the weight of his expectations. I didn't feel the sting of his disappointment. I just felt a profound sense of pity. "I'm a nurse, Dad," I said quietly. "I know how to recognize a terminal case, and this? This is as dead as it gets." As they led Richard and a hysterical Eleanor out of the room, Chloe stood frozen, looking at the wreckage of her life. She looked at David, then at me, her lower lip trembling. "Sarah, we're sisters," she whispered. "You won't let them take everything, will you? David, you have so much. What's a few million to you?" David didn't even look at her. He looked at me, waiting for my word. He had the power to crush her, to leave her with nothing, or to show a mercy she didn't deserve. "You remember what you told me at the hospital, Chloe?" I asked, stepping closer to her. "You told me that I had made my bed and I had to lie in it. You told me that being a miller meant something." I was just stressed," she lied, her eyes darting toward the agents. "No," I said. "You were being yourself. And now, you're going to find out what it's like to live the life you were so afraid of. The life of someone who has to work for what they have. David's offer stands. The call center is hiring. I suggest you take the job before they run a background check on your last name." She let out a sob, but the agents moved her along, escorting the remnants of the Miller legacy out of the building. Finally, the room was quiet. It was just me, David, and my Uncle Arthur. The man I thought was dead looked at me with tears in his eyes. "You look so much like your grandmother," Arthur said softly. "She would have been so proud of the woman you'd become. Not because of the money, but because you stayed true to yourself." I hugged him, feeling a piece of my history slot back into place, but then I turned to David. My husband. The man who had spent a decade playing a part, living a humble life, working under car hoods and coming home with grease under his fingernails just to protect me from a threat I didn't even know existed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. 10 years, David. We lived in that small apartment. We struggled. I worked double shifts at the hospital to help pay the rent when the shop was slow. David took both of my hands in his. His palms were rough. He really had been working, really had been living that life. "Because I needed to know," he said, his eyes filled with a raw, honest love. "I needed to know that if I lost everything, if the world fell apart, you would still be there, and I needed you to know that your value had nothing to do with your father's bank account. If I had come to you as a Vance, you would have always wondered if you were just another acquisition. I wanted to be the man you chose, not the man you were expected to marry." "And the shop?" I asked. "Was it all a lie?" "The shop is real," he smiled. "I love that place. There's something honest about fixing something that's broken. But tonight, Sarah, I realized that some things can't be fixed. They have to be replaced." He led me to the window, looking down at the city lights. Below us, the gala was still in full swing, hundreds of people drinking champagne, unaware that the empire they were celebrating had just collapsed in the penthouse above them. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," David said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a set of keys. They weren't to a luxury car or a mansion. They were the keys to the shop. "We go home. But tomorrow we decide what to do with the dealership empire. Because officially, the Millers are out. And the Vances? We prefer to keep things running smoothly." But as we turned to leave, Arthur cleared his throat. "There's one more thing, David. The ledgers Richard tried to hide, they weren't just about the company. There was a third party involved. Someone who was funding Richard's debts long before he went to the shadow lenders. David froze, the protective tension returned to his shoulders. Who? Arthur held out a single, crumpled piece of paper he had snatched from the folder before the agents took it. It was a wire transfer confirmation, dated only a week ago. The name on the sender's line made my heart stop. It wasn't a business rival. It wasn't a secret investor. It was a name that made the entire room feel like it was tilting on its axis. David, I whispered, looking at the paper. That's your father's name. The mechanic had opened the hood, and we had found the ghost. But as the elevator doors closed, I realized that the war for the Miller name was over, but the war for the Vance legacy was just beginning. My family had disowned me for marrying a mechanic, but I was beginning to realize that the grease on David's hands was the cleanest thing about this entire world. Sarah, David said, his voice dropping to a whisper as the elevator descended. Whatever we find it together. But you need to know one thing. My father didn't fund Richard to help him. He funded him to destroy him. I looked at the reflection in the polished brass of the elevator. We looked like a power couple, but I felt like a girl standing in a storm. And if he destroyed me in the process? David stepped closer, his shadow enveloping mine. Then he's about to find out what happens when you mess with a man who knows exactly how to take an engine apart. The doors opened to the lobby, and the flashbulbs of a dozen photographers blinded us. The news of the arrest had traveled faster than the elevator. The mechanic and the nurse were no longer invisible. We were the headline. And the person standing in the center of the media circus, waiting for us with a predatory smile, was a man I had only seen in business magazines. David's father. The king of logistics. And he didn't look like he was there to offer a blessing. He looked like he was there to collect a debt. David's father, Silas Vance, took a step forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor with the rhythm of a man who owned every square inch of the city. He didn't look at the police or the disgraced CEO being led away, he looked at David. You always had a talent for taking things apart, David, Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I just didn't expect you to take apart a legacy I spent $10 million trying to acquire through the back door. David didn't flinch. He kept his arm firmly around my waist. You didn't try to acquire a legacy, Dad. You tried to buy a man's soul so you could strip mine his company. Richard Miller was a failing businessman, but you were the one who made sure he stayed failing. I looked between them, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. My father, Richard Miller, hadn't just made bad investments. He had been hunted by a bigger predator. And Eleanor and Chloe had been so blinded by their thirst for status that they never noticed the shark circling their golden cage. The debt is still active, David, Silas said, flicking a glance toward me for the first time. Richard signed over the controlling shares as collateral for those loans. Technically, this dealership empire belongs to the Vance Logistics Group now. Which means it belongs to me. Actually, David said, pulling a second folder from his jacket, one he hadn't shown the agents. The debt was tied to the Miller Holding Company which, as of 20 minutes ago, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But the physical assets, the land, the inventory, the name? Those were purchased by an independent trust last month. A trust funded by a simple mechanic who saved every penny and invested it in the one thing you taught him to hate, honest work. Silas's predatory smile faltered. For the first time, the king of logistics looked human and furious. You chose them over us? Silas hissed. No, David replied, looking down at me with a warmth that made the cold lobby feel like home. I chose Sarah. And unlike you or the Millers, Sarah doesn't care about the name on the building. She cared about the man under the hood. As the police cars pulled away, taking Richard Miller toward a future of depositions and prison cells, I watched my mother, Eleanor, and my sister, Chloe, standing on the sidewalk. They looked small. Without the Miller fortune to shield them, they were just two women in expensive dresses with nowhere to go. Chloe tried to catch my eye, her face pale and pleading, but I turned away. They hadn't just disowned me, they had tried to destroy the only person who truly loved me. David and I walked past his father, through the sea of reporters, and straight to his beat-up black pickup truck parked at the curb. It looked out of place among the Ferraris and Rolls-Royces, but to me, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. "So," I said as we climbed in, the scent of motor oil and old leather grounding me. "What does a pediatric nurse do when she finds out her husband officially owns half the city's automotive industry?" David started the engine, the powerful roar echoing through the elite neighborhood. "She goes to work tomorrow and takes care of her patients. And then, she comes home to a man who still knows how to fix her sink and change her oil." He reached over, taking my hand. "My family thought money was power. Your family thought status was everything. But they both forgot that an engine only runs if the parts actually fit together." "We fit, Sarah." I leaned my head on his shoulder as we drove away from the cameras and the chaos. My family had disowned me for marrying a mechanic, but in the end, that mechanic was the only one who knew how to build a life that wouldn't break down when the road got rough. Before I leave you with the final lesson of this journey, I want to ask you, have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to love you most? What time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I love hearing where these stories land. The Millers lost their empire, and Silas Vance lost his son's respect, but David and I gained something that can't be bought at an auction. We gained the truth. And the truth is, the most expensive thing you will ever own is a clear conscience. Thank you for watching. My family disowned me for marrying a mechanic, then they learned he owned the dealership. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and true love, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the underdog finally takes the lead. Until next time, remember, never judge a man by the grease on his hands, but by the strength of his heart.